Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining AI4C for this talk on the legal aspects of artificial intelligence and machine learning. Now, you may have been wondering whether these pose bear traps or how can they be avoided? And do charities face particular legal challenges when it comes to artificial intelligence? Well, here today, I am delighted that Robert Marcus and Di Davis are going to join us, and they're going to share some of their insights into these matters and answer your questions. Now, Robert is going to be talking particularly about AI liability and perhaps some of the legal myths that we might all be encountering, while Di is going to focus on the socio-legal challenges faced by charities. So I think we're all in for quite an exciting talk with some very interesting bits of information and things that hopefully we can all take forward. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Robert to the screen and to the stage and let him take it from there. So welcome, Robert.
Thank you, Maxime. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to you, this distinguished group. I'm a liveryman of the Worshipful Company of Information Technologists and a technology lawyer, and I've been thinking about how AI fits into existing legal structures and whether they pose new challenges for the law in the context of charities in particular, or whether they are simply a development of existing issues. That's always a challenge for lawyers considering the new technology and whether old law is suitable, whether it just needs to be reimagined, tweaked, or whether it's no longer fit for its purpose and the law needs to change. There is no simple answer to that, and it of course depends, as lawyers say. Lawyers also like definitions, so I am going to start with a couple or three definitions of artificial intelligence. These are not distinctive for charities, but if you can see my screen, I've put up three there, and the first one, dynamic algorithmic rules and software implementation that change as the machine learns and processes.
I can't see your screen, Robert. Or I can't.
Let me see if I can fix that.
So one thing I like about technology, we had this all working not 2 minutes ago.
How about that?
Perfect.
Right, so you'll see these three definitions. The first one really focuses on one aspect of AI, and that is that unlike standard software, it is dynamic, it changes as the machine learns, and it also has the capability of handling big data, very large data sets. The second definition focuses on that part which is perhaps the intelligence, a set of technologies that enable computers to do things similar to what people do: perceive, learn, reason, and assist in decision-making to solve problems. So that's why AI is sometimes confused with human learning. And a definition I like, and maybe Di's not so keen, it comes from Richard Kemp, who says, it's AI until you know what it does, then it's just software. Which is in a way to perhaps demystify AI. And moving to the next slide, if I can. These are various different elements of AI. So you will all have heard of all or some of these, and some are more relevant to the actual operations of charities. Deep learning, it's sometimes called. So machine learning, natural language processing, expert systems, and then software that manipulates images, speech, planning, and enables robotics. It's all in there. The definitions don't really matter because what matters is what it does, and whether we need to worry about whether established systems can cope. So having done a little research on where a number of prominent charities now are, there are on this slide a number of examples which perhaps make this easier to relate to. The general themes around how charities are using AI is that it is a very positive tool. There are many dangers and pitfalls, but generally, and I'd like to think optimistically in terms of technology, generally, it's very positive by making the existing information that is out there in unstructured form more accessible than it otherwise was. One of the very powerful applications is natural language translation. So the myriad languages in the world can be manipulated using some sort of AI to make meaning accessible at a massively greater scale. And as well as scale, there is speed. And speed is so important. Speed generates responsiveness and new insights. So if we look at some of these examples, chatbots are very common now, using different aspects of machine learning in the charity sector to encourage donations, tell stories which motivate people, explain what charities do, and create a sense of inclusiveness. So examples are the Children's Society that is using multi-level neural machine learning in the Google Translate app to facilitate its interactions with refugees and migrant young people. Again, the language aspects of this is very important there. MenCap guides you through a conversation with a sort of person who was born with learning disabilities. She tells you about her life, provides statistics on learning disabilities while engaging in fun conversations. So it makes technology very accessible. WaterAid has a chatbot aimed at awareness raising and engagement through Facebook. Arthritis Research has developed a personal virtual assistant to help people with their particular needs and cuts out intermediate stages in the process. Cancer Research is also using image analysis to improve cancer diagnosis, immensely powerful. And so on. I won't just keep running through those, but another aspect of this is that charities are always trying to raise money. And in order to get money out of people, you have to press the right buttons and, which sounds a bit mechanistic, but you have to deliver the right messages. And AI can use machine learning on how people operate now, their existing social and environmental needs, and the impacts that charities and others are having in order to target the right messages. And in terms of donations, there are applications which are AI-based, which take micro payments, just tiny amounts of money out of people's transactions when they've given consent, but targeting those applications can be very powerful for charity fundraising. So, moving up in terms of the concepts, as Maxime said, there are difficulties in optimizing the use of AI. The charity sector is always competing for skills. AI skills are scarce and are in great demand. So that represents a challenge both for fundraising, also the leadership of charities need to improve their awareness of the risks and the opportunities. And there's an awareness and educational challenge for those of you who are responsible for leading. There's always a risk. I've called it innovation risk. You can go down the wrong path, and similarly, it's important to use AI intelligently and in a targeted way. It's quite hard to persuade funders to try a new thing. So funding for the right sort of AI is a challenge. And then there are sort of quantitative challenges, because if you put in a new system, how do you know whether the investment you've made in the new system has returned an appropriate return? And my last challenge there is what I've called dirty data. Dirty data, rubbish in, rubbish out, is always a challenge for IT systems, but where you're dealing with vast quantities of it, the problem of dirty data becomes magnified by virtue of the scale. And so you can get a lot of false results, false positives. Those are generic issues around the use of AI. Specifically legal issues, I will only touch on very, very briefly. Each one of these requires a lecture in and of itself. But where there is a machine doing something which looks and feels and may even be presented as if it is human or humanistic, issues that we are familiar with but are always struggling with need to be re-examined in the light of the fact that we have an AI agent, if you will. So issues like who is liable for when it goes wrong, who needs to protect personal information, very important in the charity sphere where there's a lot of sensitive and medical information very often, and things can get done, do get done by chatbots and other machines with no human intervention in order to exercise a judgment. Similarly, contracts need to be between legal people. If the legal people behind the AI aren't even aware that the AI is doing something in their name, can they really be said to be involved in a legally valid or enforceable transaction? And the same issues appear again and again around established concepts like agency, intellectual property, ethics, governance, regulation. All very familiar, but all need to be re-examined. And the last two I've mentioned there are equality. So technology has huge benefit and potential for reducing inequality by making its virtues and benefits available widely, but by the same or similar token, it can also be an agent for inequality. Do you have access to the technology? Who owns it? Do you only get it if you're an employee? Do you only get it if you live in a certain place? And Di will also speak about the important issue of algorithmic bias that is introduced by the machine without the owners, if you will, knowing about it. Focusing on liability, just a few examples very quickly. We are familiar, although few of us have actually sat in an autonomous vehicle, and as well as perhaps fearing for our physical safety, if we do so, we will have many questions about who is responsible for driving it safely, or what happens if it crashes. Google has withdrawn its car, and I think Uber has stopped development because these issues are not primarily ones of technology. The technology is improving as technology tends to do. As it improves and greater possibilities arise, these fundamental questions remain unanswered, and we all have to have an intelligent political, legal debate about what we do. For instance, negligence. Can a piece of AI software breach a common law duty of care? I can't tell you the answer to that. All I can do, as usual, is pose the question. Similarly, can two AI tools be guilty of price fixing? And how can a professional services firm properly balance the competing rights and responsibilities of its software provider, its clients, the firm itself, and so on. Those things which we thought we more or less knew the answers to will need to be re-examined. Similarly, as an extension of that, risk of bias is built into AI systems, and that creates ethical problems, both in terms of transparency and security. That's the downside of AI. In California, there's a rule which has recently been passed, which requires the users of chatbots to identify that a consumer is not speaking to a human being. And that is an example of a law that's been introduced because the technology has developed to the point where people are genuinely confused about who, or indeed what, they're talking to.
Robert,
there are many
here, but I think we're sort of reaching our time limits.
Good. Well, there's plenty more to be said. Let me just conclude by saying that solving these problems will involve the active participation of players in the charity sector, and I've just listed there some of the things which are not fixed and should be considered when establishing AI principles: fairness, safety, reliability, privacy, security, inclusiveness, accountability, transparency, and a conscious identification of bias. I'll leave it there. If there anything I've said which you violently disagree with or would like to raise a question, then either do so now or in the chat window or at the end. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. That was quite an interesting background to some of the legal issues that we all are going to have to face and consider. And I think you're certainly alerting us to the fact that it's not all necessarily plain sailing, that there's still some waters to be charted. So I'd like to hand over now to Di to give us his perspective on this thorny topic. Di, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Maxine, and I hope you can all now see my slide, my initial slide. So I am going to talk about two aspects of well, as I call it, machine learning, because I think Robert's given some definitions of artificial intelligence, but really, at its basic, artificial intelligence is just machine learning. It's pattern matching, if you like. Machines are stupid, but if you give them a problem with the right program, they'll solve it. So, in the same way as humans are good at sequences and filling in the next number, so if I said to you 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, well, hopefully, apart from those of you who are mathematically challenged, you'd say the next number in the sequence is 11. Fine. That's what we humans can do. That's essentially what we can program machines to do instead. It's pattern matching. And the problems come when the pattern matching exceeds the bounds of your expectation. And as was indicated by Maxine at the beginning, I'm going to talk about sociological issues, the bits that Robert touched on but didn't really delve into, the discrimination and does this actually work? And what are the problems and very, very deep rooted problems in artificial intelligence, and what are the issues that you as charities will face? And as I say, I'm going to talk about active uses, the uses made by charities, and passive uses, the uses that you won't thought of, but which you'll come across as charities. Robert put up a slide about how charities are using AI, and the interesting thing about that survey that was done was that most, by AI4C, was that most of the results were chatbots. In other words, having machines which are taking over the conversation with people who are phoning into the charity. But the problem with chatbots comes from essentially leading questions. And some of you may recognize the equipment on the right-hand side of this slide. Of course, it might be left-hand side from the way you're looking at it. I don't know whether it's left-hand, yeah, it'll be right-hand side for you as well. And it's actually Alexa. Alexa. Technology so stupid that you need 3 syllables to address it in the first place. And I suspect actually that Amazon will be very clever about realizing that you needed 3 syllables to address it, and therefore call it Alexa, because if you ever have a friend called Alexandra, you'll probably call her Alexa, not Alexandra. People don't have, by and large, 3-syllable first names. I've got a first syllable first name, and at least one other person in this talk call has a 1-syllable first name. Interesting, there's 20 people on this call. Raluca, who is the charity lady, form coordinator for WSIT, is on the call, and she has a 3-syllable name, but it's actually quite unusual. I'm not going to start asking people whether people think about their friends who have 3-4-syllable names. Do you actually have nicknames for them which are shorter? The point I'm making, though, is that even the technology is not anything like as advanced as you think it is. I mean, to say 3 syllables to address it in the first place. And then, why did I have, what was the problem that Alexa had about 2-3 weeks ago, which was to do with leading questions? Holocaust denial. And they had to take the whole system down, or take that whole area of Alexa down, and they discovered the problem quite easily, quite quickly. The problem was that if you asked Alexa a question, which was a leading question, like, are Holocaust deniers correct, or something like that, then Alexa would immediately search the internet, which is what it's trained to do, and find articles with that title or by extremists who've written on that theme, and then start repeating that, if you like, thesis back to them, despite the fact that it was false. And that's very, very easy to do, because how can Alexa determine what's, if you like, truth from untruth? The same, you may think, well, I'm a charity, that's not going to happen to me, is it? Well, actually, let's think about an example that I thought of. And remember, at the end of the day, I'm a geek who happens to be a lawyer. I don't run a charity. You can probably think of much better examples than I can. But let's suppose that you are a drug abuse, mental health, drug addiction charity, mental health type charity. And somebody asks you a question, which is a perfectly natural, I think, foreseeable question in a chatbot, like a chatbot discussion, like, well, I really want to take some heroin. What's the safe dose I can take of heroin, or whatever the conversation might be in the course of the chatbot. Now, hopefully, you'd have thought about that, and you'd have a pre-prepared response. And indeed, that would be the part of the thrust of the chatbot in the first place, because you'd be expecting that sort of question. The problem comes when you get an out-of-scope question, a question you haven't thought of. So somebody saying, I'm kind of addicted to antihistamine tablets. How many can I take? Or, I've had 4 already today. Can I have another 3? Actually, the answer to that question is 8, by the way, antihistamine tablets a day, but that's by the by. The point is, if they don't know, who knows what the answer is going to be? You don't know what the answer is going to be in that situation. Of course, the chatbot might be designed to evade the question and talk about something different in that situation, pick up on perhaps the rest of the language, and in fact not answer the question and do something different. But the problem is, at some point in time, you will get to an out-of-scope question, and it's those issues that can become a real problem, as with Alexa. And I can guarantee that however much effort you as a charity have put into trying to make sure it doesn't happen in your artificial intelligence system, it won't be as much as Amazon have tried to put into Alexa and have failed in that example. And if you avoid all that, and you say, well, if I get an out-of-scope question, I'm just going to ignore it, and I'm going to go back to my pre-programmed discussion about whatever it may be, and simply pick up on some other word that the individual has talked about, like, well, you say that you want another 4X, it doesn't matter what X is, of drugs, and I'm going to talk and talk about something else, about any overuse of drugs is, well, that's fine, but you're not actually dealing with the person's question in the first place, which may be fine, may not be. And again, in that situation, it's not really machine learning, because you're not letting the machine go outside the bounds of what it's pre-programmed to do in the first place. So that's an example of active use by charities and the issues that you will, at some point in time, come across. And hopefully they won't be as newsworthy as Alexa's was in the case of Holocaust denial. What about passive use? What do I mean by passive use? Well, I'm going to introduce something called the A implies B implies C problem, which is an enormous problem, and in fact a fundamental issue when it comes to the use of artificial intelligence practically. Because if you think about the way people want to use artificial intelligence, by people I mean banks, big organizations want to use artificial intelligence. They want to, I don't say dehumanize the process, but they want to make things cheaper, and making things cheaper equals not using humans but using computers. So let's think about 2 examples, and I'm going to relate these back to charities, because you've got to say, well, I'm not a bank, I don't have to worry about this, but you do. And the example I'm going to use is gender equality. You'll probably know that European law requires you to not discriminate between male and female insurance. Whether it's driving insurance, whether it's life insurance, you have to treat male and female identical. You can't say, well, we all know that women live longer, so if we're going to give you life insurance, it should be cheaper for a woman than a man. You can't do that. You're not allowed to. Whether it's right or wrong, I'm not commenting on. I'm just saying that's the European law. So it's dead easy, isn't it? You think, well, that's not a problem. I'm going to set up my system, which helps me work out how much I'm going to charge you for life insurance. If I've got to let it go and do it itself, it can be artificial intelligence. I don't need to intervene on it. It can work out, have a look at all this data about how long people live, and I just won't put in whether they're male or female. Simple. So I don't put in, going back to Robert's rubbish in is rubbish out. I'm not going to put in whether they're male or female, so I don't have to worry about it. Well, actually, it's not as simple as that. Because, for example, the machine might say, "Oh, this is interesting. If a single person, a single parent is living with a 5-year-old child, these people with single parents with 5-year-old child live longer than a single person just living themselves. All of the factors are identical. Is that treating people with gender inequality? The answer is, of course it is, because we all know that there are more single female parents than single male parents. That's what I mean by the A implies B implies C problem. If you were programming this manually, you'd know that, well, actually, you can't use data associating people who live with a child and people who don't live with a child, because the reality is, if they're a single parent, they're much more likely to be female than they are male. Fact. Why does this have an issue on charities? Well, if you're a gender equality charity, it matters a great deal, because people will be coming to you saying, why am I getting refused life insurance when somebody who seems to be same equal to me is not? And of course, you don't know that. And the only way you can address that issue is by approaching the bank and helping people approach the bank. The point is that there'll be more demand for services in that regard if you're a charity of that state. Another example, and then I'm going to shut up, is racial discrimination, financial exclusion, the same type of thing. Black Lives Matter has been in the news greatly recently, and exactly the same thing can happen in terms of race. You say, well, I'm not interested in people's race. I'm not interested in that. I don't want to distinguish between what racial background people have as to whether I give them determination, whether I'm going to give them a loan or not. But actually, yes, you don't put what race they are in the import. So you think, well, I haven't got a problem here because I'm not even collecting data as to whether they're white, black, whatever their background is. As far as I'm concerned, are completely equal to me. Actually, in reality, it's very difficult to exclude that. Because you're then looking at masses of data, and you come up with a statistic which may be false or may be right or may be false. Like generally, life insurance, I can tell you the answers because I know about them. I don't know. Well, but if you determined that there was a greater problem about people repaying debts from, I don't know, let's say Rochdale, which has a greater black population than, Berwick upon Tweed, again, a question of fact, it does. Can you use that information? How do you stop the computer using that information and essentially having indirect racial indiscrimination? Again, if you're a charity of that sort, that's the sort of issues you're going to get passively. You're not involved in them, but you're going to get greater queries as a result of them. So those are the things that I hope I've made you think about. And I'm going to pass you back to Maxine now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Di. Very interesting. A completely different point of view and quite a different perspective on the whole topic. And I'm hoping that some of you might have got some questions that you'd like to ask. And I have a feeling that that Richard certainly has got a question for you. I don't know if he wants to ask one of you in particular. But if you want to ask a question, if you want to unmute yourself and stick your hand up, then I will invite you in. Richard, quick off the mark as usual. So please, what would you like to ask and who do you want to ask?
Would you like me to just enunciate the questions I put in chat, Maxine?
Perfect.
So I had two that just came to mind. I mean, the first one is, I don't know who can give me the answer to this. I've heard a lot of presentations on legal issues, and a lot of people sort of mither on, well, judges will have to resolve these things, you know. So essentially it's a sort of common law will come to the rescue. And it seems to me, you know, if people are thinking common law will come to the rescue, then they're pretty much saying it's not much of a problem. It's just an old legal issue with a new twist. And that's often what we say in AI, in computer science ethics books. It's old law, but with a new twist. But I wondered if anyone was considering, any country was considering primary legislation or the equivalent, because there's a sort of signal that there is some genuinely new issue that's hitting us. And I wondered if anyone knows the answer to that, because I just don't know the answer.
I'll answer it if, Robert's thinking, if you like. My view of most governments, most of the world, is they run a mile. They run a mile because they're too afraid of losing votes. They have no idea what's going to win in votes, what's going to lose in votes, so they'll just run a mile. If you look at the lack of law that there has been in this country in the last 20 years, it's completely and utterly bonkers. You know, we don't make law for anything in this country. People talk about, for example, GDPR, which was a factor we talked about before this talk. You know, that GDPR legislation was passed in 2016, came into force in 2018. It was originally published late 2013, originally drafted 2 years before in 2011. We didn't even have cloud computing in 2011 when it was first drafted. It's that out of date. Most legislation is completely useless because it's completely out of date. The UK government has, and if you ask them the question, they'll say, look at us, we're brilliant. What the UK government done is passed some legislation about Class 5 motor vehicles. Now, I'm not going to start talking about motor vehicles because, as Robert said before, that's another talk. But suffice to say that a Class 5 vehicle is a vehicle that can take me automatically to one of my son's friend's house. Now, one of my son's friends lives down a private drive, which goes to Manor House. Fine. It's down a mile. And then you have to go round the back of the manor house for another half a mile on a dirt track, and then it goes into a field with no boundaries on either side, and you have to drive to the house. Now, that's a Class 5 car, which will take you along a dirt field, on the track on the dirt field, with no boundaries on either side. We're never going to get to that stage in probably any of the people listening to this table's lifetime. But they've made legislation about that. You know, the automated cars they're talking about on roads are Class 2 or Class 3. They do a bit of automatic driving and not get you out the lane, in theory, on a motorway. The point is that they're completely useless governments. And so the answer is, what will happen is exactly what you said, Richard, that courts will have to grapple with legislation that they got on the books and do the best they can.
So, Guy, what about other countries? Because your implication was that the British government was particularly useless. Well, fine. But other countries?
Richard, I do have an example. Only a few days ago, the competition commissioner in the EU just published some new rules. And this is as political as it is legal. But they will now require dominant technology companies to explain how their algorithms work, so as to make sure that companies are held responsible for decisions made by those algorithms. So whilst Di is absolutely right in terms of the UK government, which tends to be a follower, the European Commission is quite proactive in promoting new legislation. Other countries are quite positive as well. I mentioned something in California. The Dutch are also quite proactive. So there are examples, not very many, but and many of them, as I've said, like this EU initiative, is about holding big tech to account as much as deficiencies in the existing rules, for instance, competition rules. So there's a lot of appearance in this. In the field of intellectual property, there have been a number of cases, no legislation, but where AI created inventions cannot be patented because the law requires there to be an inventor. And the cases are in France and I believe in the Netherlands as well, and in the European courts, have refused to register patents because nobody would stand up and say, it was me, it was my idea, my invention. And that might be the right approach.
And if I can interrupt you a moment there, Robert, I think that's one of the perhaps issues that our charities might be thinking about, and two sides of it really. If they're working with a supplier who provides the algorithm, but the charity is providing the data, one is what's created out of that asset. Who does that asset belong to? In this case, we know people are obviously thinking about patenting it, but who owns that asset? Can it be transported to another supplier to work on? And the second thing is, if that algorithm does something heinous, I don't know what it might be, who has the liability there? Is it the supplier or is it the charity?
Well, I think the first problem isn't novel. You need to deconstruct who owns what component of the hybrid product, and that is the stuff of existing intellectual property law. Never easy, but there's usually an answer. And I don't think conceptually the problem is different because it's different in scale. The second question is much more tricky in my view, because liability implies fault and responsibility and remedies and ultimately going to prison. And you can't send a machine to prison. So it begins to fall apart. And so I think we do need to think very seriously about where responsibility and, in legal terms, liability rests for these things.
I mean, the practical reality is that in a situation which you describe, like an organisation such as a charity is allowing a third party to access its data and use it for X, to use Robert's word of responsibility, the responsibility for using that data is undoubtedly the third party. The asset is being modified by the third party and used by the third party for a use which is usually outside the expectation of the charity in the first place. It's that both the rights to the benefit of that invention and that use are going to lie with the third party, and so is the actual resultant asset. Going to a sort of real example, which would be Iceland, as a government, sold access to their entirety of the medical database of everybody who lives in Iceland. Any use you make of that, you have to pay for the use, but any use you make of that, if you discover something as a result of analysing that data in a certain way, it's yours.
That's very interesting. I noticed that Chris has put his hand up. Chris, you've got a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a comment on the last conversation, if I may. It seems to me that the issue of liability in the case of automated vehicles, there is legislation in the books. I think I saw it speeding past your slide set, Robert, the AEVA, but it doesn't really bite yet. And of course, nothing's come before the courts, but there will be lots of other situations in which liability for the use of AI is going to be quite an interesting one. I mean, if a charity's AI gives advice to one of their clients, patients, I'm not sure what you call them, and it goes badly wrong, where does liability lie in that case? I'm sure the courts will have a lot of fun with that. May I just add a question? I mean, you can respond to that. Can I add a question? I wonder what the panelists feel about the issue of giving AI legal personality.
Whether you give them names or not is a sociological question, which I'm not going to answer. But going back to the comment you made, I mean, if your chatbot does something, inverted commas, wrong, you are liable. to use a classic example, if I buy a book which tells me which mushrooms I can eat and which mushrooms are not safe, and it tells me I can eat mushrooms which are not safe, the book publisher is liable. Cases to that effect. It's exactly the same. If I have a chat, if I'm having a chat with your chatbot, and your chatbot tells me, in the case, going back to my drug example, that I can do something, yes, you shouldn't do it, but you can, and I do it, and I am injured, then yes, could there be liability for the chatbot? Absolutely. In reality, who would liability rest with? In that example, almost certainly would rest with the charity. Whether you could pass the buck to the person, third party who'd written the software is down to contract. Again, if you think about the road the road example, which is perhaps easier to contemplate, the government are going to allow class 2, class 3 cars to drive automatically on roads, lorries in convoys. If it goes wrong, who's liable? Is it the person who's written the software, or is it the person who's actually physically sitting behind the driver's wheel in the lorry? The answer is, I have no idea, and neither the government. The government doesn't want to tell you, so you'll have to go to court and decide.
Well,
in reality,
I also have no idea, but I don't really like saying to people there is no answers to this. So I would stick my neck out and say, to Chris's question, no, it is absurd to give legal personality to an algorithm or a chatbot or a machine learning piece of software. It has to be, you have to look behind it to the person, to the legal person who is responsible or who is providing it. And as you say, that becomes a question of fact, that becomes a question, even dare I say, of common sense and contract. So what is different from the normal situation where, say, a charity would provide information, and I see in the chat that Fiona has made the point that at least her charity doesn't give advice but gives information. I'm sorry to say that is not a complete defense to a claim that somebody relied on the expertise or the purported expertise of a charity giving information in a context could still be held responsible for giving, if you will, the wrong information, which is akin to giving poor advice. But notwithstanding that, I think it's the way that we should look at this is, it is the person with whom, or the organization with whom the person who is relying on or using the AI device, they are interacting, they have a primary relationship. It may be that, say, the charity who is using an AI device could find issue with the software developer. But why this is an interesting and potentially legally novel issue is that the software developer would say, well, it's not my fault. It was your data that our machine learning algorithm then analyzed to come up with the arguably wrong answer. And therefore it's not poor programming, it's it's the fault of the data on which the algorithm then did its magic.
There are interesting parallels with animals. In the state of New York, there was a case in 2015 in which there was an attempt to give legal personality to 2 chimpanzees, which was thrown out on the grounds that they could neither accept obligations nor fail to. And there's a case before in the same state at the moment in relation to Happy the elephant.
Well, thank you, Chris. In my view, Happy the elephant and the chimpanzees are considerably closer to legal persons than AI algorithms, because we have moral and ethical obligations and legal obligations not to be cruel to chimpanzees and elephants. And I feel no moral compunction in pulling the plug on an AI algorithm.
Well, I think it's quite reassuring that at least we've only got 2 parties that we need to worry about. from a charity perspective, the charity and the supplier, and that we don't have an offspring in the middle that could leap up and take over something as having a personality in its own right.
Well, that's my view, but others, serious commentators and scholars, take a different view. I think they're wrong, but you know,
I'm with you, Robert.
I agree with you, Robert. I agree with you.
I'm a little conscious of the time here, but and I don't know if anybody else would like to raise a particular question. If anybody does, do please come off mute sort of fairly soonish and pop
Otherwise,
your hand up, because otherwise I can see. Otherwise you're...
I'll make a concluding remark, if I may.
Oh, you may, please do, because I was going to tell you what my observation was from listening to it, but if you've got a concluding remark, please go ahead.
Well, it has to do, goes back to Richard's question, which is, you know, what are governments doing about it? I didn't finish the story and tell you what this new law that we do have in the UK, as it applies to class 5, but only class 5 vehicles, actually says. Because it's a complete cop-out. What it actually says is that if you have an accident with a class 5 vehicle, this 100% automated vehicle, that your insurer, so I have an accident in my car with this vehicle, my insurer pays, which means I pay because it comes off my no claims bonus. And the theory is that if enough insurers have claims, they'll bring a claim against the artificial intelligence person who wrote this software. It's a complete cop-out.
Well, Di, it is a cop-out if you're an intellectual purist, but as a matter of pragmatism, it's not a bad solution because it gives you an answer.
I accept it has that benefit, Robert. I can't argue with that. But it's not, to me, it's not much of an answer.
Well, I think that
Right.
absolutely typifies what we've been listening to in this fascinating talk, and that is that we may have thought artificial intelligence is pretty new, but it seems to me that the legal coverage is even newer. It's a much more immature place than ever imagined, and that we better take great care in what we're doing to consider those legal aspects, because there's not going to be anybody else looking over our shoulders taking care of it for us. And I look forward to us having more debates on the situation as things change. So I think as we're coming to the end, I'd like to thank everybody for participating, and particularly to Di and Robert for sharing their insights and expertise, and great to have some questions for the floor. So thank you all very much. And if I don't speak to you again, I hope you'll have a super Christmas. Thank you very much, everybody.